Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is that one kind of pointy fry that you can sort of use at the end to stab the fries that have too much ketchup on them. Kind of use it as like a little fork. Really like that fry. So Sabalenka, in a really good and bad spot here. She's had a rough patch, since winning, a bunch of titles in a row. She's been struggling, some losses she won't be happy with. The loss to Anisimova at Wimbledon, I don't think it was that bad. Anisimova was in good form and plays well against her. But, she wants big titles, and this is one she'll want to get. It's a good spot because the pressure is kind of off her here. The eyes are on Swiatek. Goff is, expected to play well. Rybakina just had a good week, so it's a spot where Sabalenka is the first seed. She's the favorite, but I don't really think she has a lot of pressure to win. She might not feel that way. I think one of the hallmarks of this sort of stretch of, I wouldn't call it a slump. She's still winning a bunch. I think just, falling a bit short at the end and taking some losses after such a consistent patch. I think she just kind of reacted poorly on court a couple times. And that's a thing that she had early in her career when she lost a bit more. So it'll be interesting to see how she manages her nerves here. The conditions should be pretty good this week. There can be some windy days at Flushing Meadows, but, the weather is decent. The courts are fast. Sabalenka's playing, not bad. The loss to Rybakina is not too bad. Decent opener for her here, too, against another, big server. Mazarova has a lot of power, good ground strokes. She's kind of like a slightly less powerful version of Sabalenka at this point, not really as consistent. And Sabalenka beat her earlier this year, 2-6 in Berlin. So clearly Mazarova can hold serve a lot, but I don't think she's going to win this match. Hasn't really had the best time on hard court, really. The loss to Christea is not bad, but the loss to, Jean is a level below Sabalenka for sure. Same thing with Wang Yafan. So a good start for Sabalenka. She has a decent draw. Kudermetova is not really playing her best, and I might expect her to beat Parithas Diaz. I think Nuria, is around even odds here, and I don't really know why. Close match with Wang Yafan, but not a lot to really point to her playing well here. Just a lot of close losses to players in the middle of the pack, where I guess you could say Kudermetova is, but Polona has kind of gotten herself together. Also some close losses, but I think they're to tour level players. Lamens, Seidel was playing really well. Eva Lees can always, take the racket out of your hands when she's hitting well with her backhand. I like Kudermetova there. I think, the courts do favor Nuria's flat hitting, but I think, these players like Kudermetova and Sramkova, they're very consistent baseliners, and they can go off the rails and lose a bunch of matches in a row. But I think against, players who don't have a big offense, I think they can find their range by the end of the match. I think you see it with Potapova too. She's a bit more offensive, but even in the matches where she's up against it and it seems like she's going to crash out, she genuinely finds a way to just kind of hit until, she's landing shots. And at that point, I think she's a bit more effective. So I think she can win that in 3. Again, the price, this isn't about betting, but when you see a very strange price like that, Parithas Diaz is ranked much lower, hasn't been playing that well. I know Kudermetova is in a slump, but it's a strange price, so it's one I'd probably just leave alone, But for the purposes of the video, I do think Polona is playing a bit better. Elsa Giacomo is really solid, great server, and has a little hope here. I think the best Marie Buzkova just beats her, just on consistency. It's just really hard to hit through her, and it tends to make people force themselves into errors. But Buzkova just retired from her last match with a hip groin issue. It's hard to turn that around in a week, but it is the sort of issue that you might play with anyway. So not sure she's 100% here. If she's not, Elsa has a really big first serve and good power and is, getting better gradually. So could end up being close. She could earn a retirement. I think Buskova still wins. Just a bit more solid, a bit more consistent. But it could take 3 sets, if she's not 100%. Marino has played Fernandez before. She won. It was in 2022, but she beat her in straight sets. It's good to be familiar with the player. They're both from Canada, and when you play someone from your same country, it's very comfortable. There are more upsets, I think, in those. Statistically, maybe it doesn't pan out that way, but just from following tennis, it feels that way. It feels like if you're gonna snag somebody, the player you've trained with before, the players you've watched growing up, or just the players you can kind of figure out. I don't think Marino's mobility really makes her a good matchup against Fernandez, but she serves well. She beat Hontama, Dominika Salkova. She beat Tara Rude in qualifying. These are decent wins. Those players are mostly baseliners, so good prep for Fernandez. And honestly, Leylah plays great one week and crashes out the next, and it's hard to really predict why. It doesn't seem to be an issue with opponents. Obviously, she can get out hit. She does like to take the ball early, which can lead to some, forehand errors. I've talked about that before, the half volley being something she kind of forces when I don't think she needs to, but overall she should win this match. It's a formula to beat Marino. You just need to get returns and play deep, and once you do, you can move her and score. So I expect Leylah to get it done. Alyssa Ahn, I guess that's Christie's sister. Nice to see her getting a wild card. There's nothing really in her, I'll show it to you. There's nothing really in her recent play, to indicate she's going to get something done here. Mertens is just a really tough draw. Mertens is a gatekeeper in general, between the bottom, that 20 to 100 ranked players and the top 20. And convenient here that she's ranked 19th, because that's, really what she does. She does not give up bad losses, just really solid. So that's probably her in 2 lopsided sets there. Osorio withdrew with an abdominal injury. Like I said, it's not clear, how hampered these players will be when they have that, but it's hard to recover quickly. It's something you can play with, but, the more you exert, the more it kind of rises up again. So hard to heal in a week, unless it was very minor, unless it was just, a strain. But again, professional tennis is gonna it's tough on your core. It's tough on your abs. So this is a tough spot. I think Lulu can win. Osorio hasn't really been playing great lately. Neither has Lulu Sun. She's, kind of lost her consistency on offense and wasn't really a great defender to begin with. So she'll have to play really well there. Again, if Osorio is injured, I'm throwing out a lot of ifs, but she won't win. Claire Liu is playing really well, beat Buksha before. Christina Buksha can play, I think she's a player who plays better against better opponents, because she does have a big offense. Her game sort of translates better to scoring on better opponents, but when she has players who are just going to grind it out, it's hard for her to win. Claire's hitting the ball well this week. She came through qualifying with good wins too. It wasn't the easiest draw for her. Veronika Erdjavec is really, really solid at this point. Madison Inglis has been playing well. Kawa has good power. Just good play from Liu, and I think she'll win there. It's certainly possible for Buksha to wake up, but I think this is where qualifiers really tend to thrive, is when they play these tour level players who are just kind of in a slump coming into the majors. It's hard to get your best game together. Easy to feel flustered too when you're playing a qualifier who's very hungry for the win, and you're sort of looking to find your feet. You expect to win, and you're expected to win also, which can add to a little pressure, for a young player. Ayala's been losing, but not bad losses. 3 sets with Vondrousova, 3 sets with Kudrikova, who played well that week. 3 sets with Joint. Wins against Yastremska and Gracheva, and it gives her a decent chance here. Towson lost to Kudermetova last week, but I watched pretty much that whole match, and it wasn't really a loss. Towson should have closed out. She had a ton of chances. Kudermetova won every single big point she needed to in the second set to kind of come back from a break. She was a set and a breakdown. Things looked pretty bad, and she just had a good run of luck and then decent play in the third to get through there. So I don't really rate that as a loss for Towson or a sign that she's in trouble in any way. So Towson has the power here to actually hit through Ayala. Ayala is going to extend rallies. Picture a player like Fernandez or Vondrousova who's just extending rallies and hitting the ball solid. I think Ayala does well to keep her first serve percentage up. It's not a big serve. She just lands it a lot. And I think, that'll be very important against Towson, because if you're hitting second serves, Towson's going to take the racket out of your hands. If you're hitting first serves, she's likely to chip more of those back. It's just that players tend to be a little more reactive on first serves and a little more planning things out on a second. So I think Towson, wins in 2 or 3. I think she just is playing much better. It'd be another heroic performance from Ayala, but the fact that she's lost deciding sets to these other players recently who are at a slightly lower level than Towson, I think Towson wins. Clara also has really worked on her fitness this year. She still has, some issues with exerting, throughout an entire match, but she can play in a third set, which was not the case, a year and a half ago. Wild card for Julieta Pereira is very well deserved. She's tremendous baseliner, a bit short, compared to some of the top players on tour, but she really defends well. Quick player, smart shot selection, uses drop shots well. I just think, a bit too much there at this moment with Rybakina. Rybakina has some losses against, short baseliners like Clara Burrell and a handful of others. She struggles with Paolini at times, but I think, she's serving really well right now. She played well in, was it Cincinnati? Yeah, she played well in Cincinnati, served excellent throughout. I caught a lot of the match against Keys, and, just played very clutch, played solid throughout, and seems to be enjoying tennis again, so she should win that in 2. Bronzetti with a tough draw. She's been playing decent the past few weeks and never gives up. Most of the time I'd say she's going to, make a better player work for it. Right now, Valentova is really bringing it. The expectations are there as a former top junior, but she's winning. The qualifying run was, I'll show you some score lines. 6-2, 6-2. You look at the odds, minus 1250, and she backed it up. She's crushing people, and she's expected to. The loss to Bushkova says, Bronzetti might present a problem, but Bronzetti just lost to Golubic. Not really the best. If you want a good look at Valentova's game, that's a good time to tune in, because Bronzetti's going to make her play a ton of balls. I just think, Valentova, if you watch her forehand is really powerful. If the ball gets up a little bit high, she just muscles over it and sends it, inside out down the line, wherever she wants, and it's hard to play her when she's in control. Shibahara, not the best draw considering how well she's playing, but, Raducanu is snaggable, I think. When she's in a good rhythm, she looks like a top player. When she makes an error, it tends to lead to another error. So, 3 sets with Sabalenka in the last event, not a bad result. She really cooked Danilovic. I thought that would be a close match, but she, played her well. So Raducanu is back to being a top player this season. For the first full season, I think she's really played well. But, Shibahara tends to defend well. The match against Gracheva, I didn't really think she'd win. But, I caught one of her early matches at qualifying against Kayla Day. And Kayla wasn't really, she didn't look like she'd been playing a lot of matches recently. Just wasn't really prepared to go the long yards on defense. But the one thing I was impressed with was Ina's depth on her shots. She's really guiding the ball and finding good depth, hitting the ball near the baseline. And, that can make players unravel. So it'll be interesting to see if she can kind of wear down Emma mentally. Obviously, here on grass, playing in Britain, not the best data point here. So, I do think this one might be a bit closer. And yeah, maybe I'll be wrong. It's good for tennis sometimes for me to be wrong, because I do kind of lean into the qualifiers being very competitive. And, if the better players win, it means they're in good form. So, Raducanu should win the match. I just don't think it'd be easy. I don't think, 7-1 odds is really accurate there. I think if they play 7 times tomorrow, I think Shibahara wins, 2 matches out of the 7 at least. Tien is a new player. Really, really good forehand. She's able to T-serve, which is interesting for a shorter player. Able to land some serves and score some points. Pretty good slice backhand. Just a very compact but aggressive game. And, she's kind of come out of nowhere. First player to qualify from Indonesia in a long time. She beat Ito in the final of qualifying. Just really had a easier time holding serve there. Ito is a really good player and has been beating tour level players. So that's a big win. Tien also crushed Lepchenko, which is never an easy out. When they play these veterans is where I really look for the players to kind of, stumble or prove it. And Tien really proved it. Kudermetova is playing well. She took a set off Paolini. She, made the semis in that event. And I just thought the way she got there was a little sketchy. She probably should have lost to Towson. The one thing I'll say for her is she's serving well right now. And, when she's serving well, the unforced errors don't flow as much because she tends to get a lot more shallow returns when she's on offense. So, big test for Tien. At this point, her ceiling is very unestablished. She lost to Marcinko. That's not the best. She lost to Wang. That's, the type of player that, makes you think Veronica could beat her also. Lost to McNally. It seems right at tour level is where she's had kind of some struggles. But she seems to be improving, in the past couple of weeks and trending in a really good direction. I think she's more consistent than Kudermetova from the baseline, actually. So it'll be interesting to see if Veronica serves well. If she does, she should win. If not, this one I think is very much in the balance. I might expect Tien to get through, especially since Veronica just had a deep run. It's easy to kind of show up for the next tournament and be a little not flat with your shot making, but just a bit expecting it to just flow mentally out there. Not as focused. Kessler should beat Lynette. It could be close. She won the last meeting in Brisbane 6-4, 6-4. The difference there, I think Kessler's just a little bit more direct about her approach. Lynette plays, Lynette has a good serve. She tracks the ball well. There's no easy out there. I just think Kessler has a more, a bit more pace on the ball when they're just hitting hard back and forth. I think Lynette is looking more to apply shape and kind of maneuver her opponent. And I think Kessler's going to be the player who can get more pressure on her during neutral rallies. She's able to lean into her backhand well, takes her forehand down the line well. Should be a long match, but I kind of like Kessler's side there. So like Mateva, great run through qualifying. I thought she'd have trouble in her final round against Akli, who won some good matches, beat Harriet Dart. Select Mateva, if you don't know her, she's a tallish lefty. Hits really big ground strokes, very aggressive. Kind of reminds me of early Ben Shelton in a way. The errors can flow at the same time with such a big hitter. So sometimes she'll crash out of a set. That makes Vondrousova a tough out. They just played at the French on clay. 6-4, 6-4 is not really that bad there. I think Solikmateva is a player I thought would be competitive in that match also. These are better conditions for her. I just think it's going to take a lot to hit through Vondrousova for 3 sets. I wouldn't be surprised if they split sets. Solikmateva is the type of player who gets going and can win 3 or 4 games in a row. It's just in those interim periods, I'm not sure how she'll deal with the slice. Running down drop shots might not be her best situation. And if Vondrousova serves well, I think she's a decent favorite there. Could be close though. Jovic playing really well lately. She lost to Ann Lee last week in a little bit of a disappointing match, but there was a day-long rain delay there, and it kind of throws things into a bit of a chaotic state there. You don't know if the players really want to fully be at the tournament after a while. The stop and start stuff is tough to manage. It's a situation where players get frustrated, and when you're frustrated and you think things have kind of gone in an annoying way, very easy on the court to start to tell that story of, oh, I'm losing because the tournament director didn't do this, or I'm losing because the weather here is terrible, or I'm losing. You just start storytelling, and you have a decent excuse. And when you have a decent excuse, it's a time where it's really important to focus, because you can check out of matches kind of easily. That's not what Jovic did. She played well. I just think not a disastrous loss for her to lose to Ann Lee. Ann Lee also played really well last week, and she is capable of some good tennis. She's been a player who struggled here and there, but kind of has gotten it back together recently. So I think Jovic hits a little bigger than Sasnovich. I think she really will want to stay away from Alexandra's backhand in this one. Sasnovich spreads the ball really well with her backhand. She can take it down the line, hits it pretty flat. Hasn't really had, huge results lately, which is why I like, Jovic's side. She's been playing lower level tournaments and not really winning. So I like Eva there. Destiny Aeva, she's the thumbnail today. I have to give her a lot of credit for winning and qualifying. She was a player who I was a bit critical of. I said, she wasn't really always match fit. It seemed like tennis wasn't, even though she's training and playing great, it wasn't really her main priority at times. That's different. That's changed. She looked incredibly fit at the tournament, was able to play, long matches against Seidel, grinded it out against Mikkelskite. And, beating Sarah Bejlek is always a huge win for me. So really well-earned journey through qualifying there. She should be happy with herself no matter what happens here. Tough out against Paolini. I think Paolini's, she had those finals last season or the season before. Hasn't really totally backed it up at the majors, but it's hard to back up a finals, at a major. It's nearly impossible to back up 2 unless you're already, in the top 3. So I think Paolini's a dark horse here. I think, slightly cooler conditions are going to make her tough to hit through. She's trending in the right direction at the right time. I think also she's had a kind of a rough year already, and the players who kind of haven't played as many matches tend to do really well in the second half of the season. You'll see the players go to Asia after this, and some players are just, you can see they're exhausted and the heat is too much for them. So the U.S. Open is where players start to just look, a bit like they've been through, some difficult weather. They just look a bit fatigued, a bit blank on the court. So I think Paolini can really thrive here. She's in a decent section of the draw too, I think. Some tough tests there with Jovic next round, but it's the kind of match you expect her to win if she goes on a deep run. I just know that when I went through my draw, I had a hard time really saying she would definitely lose in any of the rounds before the semis and finals. So should be interesting to see how she fares here. Pegula should beat Sharif. Sharif doesn't win much off of clay, not having a great year. So, Pegula also could go on a very good run this tournament. She's always that player you write off because, she missed some of her big moments. That loss to Raducanu at the U.S. Open felt like, that was a spot where she really could have possibly won the tournament. But, it doesn't mean she can't win a tournament. She's in the mix for a major if she plays well. Starodubtseva and Blinkova, you couldn't really find two harder players to predict. Starodubtseva can lose 6-4 and win the next set 6-1 and then lose the match. Just really a good baseliner, but, some injury issues, some focus issues out there, and some consistency issues, which is, I guess she is hitting the ball huge every time. So when I see her playing consistent baseline tennis, that's her peaking, and what happens in the other matches isn't really her losing the plot. I guess it's just attempting to find that rhythm. Blinkova really still good, still very effective, but a player who, one day she plays great and the next round she, can't find the court. So, whoever kind of decides to grind it out there and decides they're going to make it clear that they're not checking out of rallies, I think will win that one because, both players are going to make errors. For me, I think Staro's a bit more active, but Blinkova's a little bit more experienced. So I couldn't tell you who's going to win that one. Just very close. I'll actually check what the odds even are. Yeah, so basically even odds. And yeah, I guess, you take your favorite player there if you had to take someone. I don't have to. You can't make me. I'll run away. But yeah, I'm a Staro fan, so I might back her there. Just a bit more active, I think, than Blinkova at this point. A bit younger. Azarenka against Inouye. Inouye, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, but, she hasn't really played a lot. I mean, she hasn't really played anyone at this level, but she's playing great. She won almost every round as an underdog. Beating Simona Walter is good. Beating Stefanini is great. Given it's not the level that Stefanini plays at, it's the style of tennis she plays. She just hits the ball constantly. So if you're beating her, you're not only imposing yourself in the match, but you're also staying consistent. So, now she gets a chance to play someone who just lost to Zakharova, who hasn't really played great this season. So, the wins for Azarenka make it look like she's herself. The losses, don't. Danilovic, Freck, Zakharova, just really not the best results. So, the upset is very possible here if Azarenka shows up, a little bit rusty. And my app reset. Where are we? Yastremska should beat Pavlyuchenkova. Pavlyuchenkova's kind of donating some wins lately, not really the sharpest. Just lost to Ruzic. Ruzic is just playing well. Ito is playing well. Lise is playing well. All these players are playing well, but, it's there for the taking. Yastremska had a withdrawal, so not really an automatic win there for her, but I do think she's been playing, better tennis this season. Good fight out there. Samsonova playing well again. Yue Yuan should, acquit herself well. I think when she's the bigger hitter, she's pretty dominant. She's not the bigger hitter there, though. Samsonova has a better serve, huge forehand, so should be straightforward for her. Priscilla Hans serving really well. For the WTA, there aren't too many players with huge serves, and Han is one of those. She uses a big racket, big forehand. The reason she doesn't win year round is because, it's hard to serve well all the time. But, she's in good form, played well in qualifying. I don't think she was, expected to come through. So just good wins. Jean is going to make her play a million balls, but I think she's up to it right now. I think she'll have an easier time holding serve too. A lot of the Jean matches have, 4 or 5 breaks every set. And I think Priscilla Han's ability to hold serve there in a big moment will be key. Sramkova Lee, is interesting. I mean, Lee, based off the last week, should win. Sremkova's not really playing her best. I just think it's another one of those spots where, Sremkova can find the good defense here. She's been playing decent, so I think she has a pretty good chance there against Anne. If Anne plays well, she has, a lot of power on her strokes. She serves a little bit better than Sremkova. Rebecca's just kind of looking, to find that moment, that tennis that got her across the finish line before. So be interesting to see if she can. Ann Lee, struggled. She broke out really early on tour by hitting to very small targets with a lot of shape. Really interesting to watch her play. Then she kind of got into fitness, got very, very muscular, kind of suffered with her results at that point. Kind of moved away from that now. Still very fit. Obviously, all these tennis players are great athletes, but, she's shifted now and starting to play a little bit more like herself again. Zhang was really good in qualifying. I think Bencic could be in a bit of trouble there. Bencic obviously trades power well. That's her best attribute. Hasn't really been automatic lately, but the losses are not against, bad players. But, 3 sets with Bouchard is not the best. I don't really like losing to Kudermetova for her because she plays, consistency is supposed to be her thing. So Kudermetova has, issues with errors. Mukova played well, the week that she Bencic lost, but Mukova's not really back to form yet. So I think Zhang could win. She had a really good win against Vidmanova in the second round of qualifying. Vidmanova, if you get a chance to watch her play, one of the better servers I've seen coming out of the, that ITF junior ranks. Really interesting game. Pretty much goes automatically to the drop shot after her serve also. So very entertaining, but Zhang zipped her in the second set. So, Zhang Shuai is a player that was on tour before. And, seeing her play well is not going to make anyone feel comfortable playing her. I think she can win that. And when Bencic wins in 3, I'm going to feel dumb. But I already feel dumb. So maybe I'm safe. Wang Yafan playing decent lately. Navarro is just losing a ton of matches lately. So anything is on the table. But, playing her home slam, she's supposed to get this done. And I think she will. I think, Wang Yafan is a player who tries to outlast everyone. And that's Navarro's thing. Navarro hits the ball a bit bigger. So, barring a day of errors and groans from the crowd, I think she wins. McNally's playing well. Should beat Teichmann. Teichmann hasn't really been winning a lot of matches lately, and McNally, had like a 14-match win streak at one point about a month ago. Danilovic, tends to beat these lower tier players like Uchijima. Uchijima, has won some sets and some matches, I guess, against top players, but I think she wins more when she's the bigger hitter or the more consistent player, and I think Danilovic kind of merges the two. She doesn't move great, but she can keep the ball in play, and she hits the ball real hard, so I think she'll apply her offense there and get through. Krejcikova-Mboko is probably the best match of the first round. Krejcikova is playing really well again. Mboko is obviously, the title winner in Toronto at her home Masters event, and, just playing great. I think she can struggle with errors at times, but she's always looking to create. She's always looking to play offense. It doesn't matter if she's down a set, a break, whatever it is. She just goes for the shot that she thinks is right. And, the athleticism is there. The court sense is there also. And I think one thing I really like about her is that if the shot isn't there in a perfect manner, she hits it anyway, however it can be hit. She's trying to hit her backhand down the line and doesn't have it perfectly lined up to hit a winner. She still just hits it down the line. She just, takes a bit off. And I think it's challenging players to, come up with shots to beat her. You don't want to go down the line and leave yourself open cross court, but you do want to challenge the player to run there. You don't want to give them the error and just force things. You don't also want to change up your shot just because, it isn't going to be a winner. You want to test your opponent, and that's really what she did in Montreal, and it was a great showing. Was it Montreal or Toronto? I'm gonna find out. Otherwise, I'll feel dumb. Montreal, yeah. Oh, I was right. Oh. Yeah, Ostapenko, I think she won both meetings when they played last year. Yeah, in 3, you can expect probably another close match. Ostapenko had a walkover recently, lost to Bronzetti, not really having, a great year. And Wang played really well in qualifying. She had one match against Martic that I watched where she really just played very clutch. So I think she could reverse that result a little bit, especially since last year she was probably at the worst she's been so far on tour. So I'm kind of expecting her to pull the upset there. Ruzic and Townsend, Townsend can play really well. She looks pretty fit this year, but I think Ruzic is just a bit more consistent. Ruzic is hitting her backhand really well. She's taking her forehand down the line well, and just had a good week in Cleveland. So I don't think I see a ton from Townsend. Beating Samsonova and Collins, and Kenin would make you say she beats Ruzic, but I don't know. I just don't think. I don't think it's there. Townsend is playing better, so it's kind of a tough spot. But I think Ruzic is a little bit more consistent at this point. I think Townsend's game can disappear for a set at a time. So, it might end up in a deciding set. I think Ruzic is a little bit more durable when it gets there. Potapova, has beaten Zhu both times they played. Zhu is getting her game back, but I kind of thought she'd win a couple matches recently that she didn't. You don't have to win every match that I think you're going to win, but in that comeback trail, I think it's important to to get those mid-level match wins. Potapova has been playing pretty poorly, losing a lot, spraying errors, but it's a match where she'll have a lot of chances. So I think it'll be close, and she probably will win. She can't lose the whole season. All these players, even in a slump, they find a way to stay on tour. The top 100 doesn't tend to have that much turnover. So I like her there. Mira Andreeva is playing Parks. Parks played extremely well in, was it Monterey? Yeah. Played really well in Monterey. Almost had Schneider. She beat Shramkova. She beat Navarro. Good wins for her, honestly. And Andreeva's not too automatic right now. She has some tricky losses this season. Parks has to serve really well there and manage her backhand a bit. That's the wing that can kind of make more errors. She has a lot of power and a lot of pace on the ball, so it's just about choosing when to kind of go big against a player like Andreeva, who's going to make you play a lot. I think Andreeva is just going to out-defend her there. So I like her in, 2 or 3 sets. Either way, I think she gets by. Keys is playing decent. Again, Zarazua is really proving she can make life difficult on anyone. She had a 3-setter with Rybakina last week that I thought was pretty impressive. But Keys should be able to expose Renata's forehand. It's just not really there. The serve is not really there. So, as long as Keys stays away from backhand exchanges, it'll be hard for Zarazua to really give her trouble. Petra Kvitova, still not really match fit. I think she's retiring, so kind of expecting Parry to just win that. It's hard when someone isn't really going to run. It's hard to, vary your shots and pick how aggressive to be, but, Parry should beat Kvitova there. Kvitova hasn't really won matches yet. Volley nets probably had the loudest qualifying matches of anybody. The crowd was really enjoying watching her play. Plays Sonmez Zeynep, which, she has a chance to win. Zeynep has been playing better, has kind of switched positions here and gotten herself on tour, and now Volley net's having to qualify again. Sonmez was having to qualify for a while. You expect a long match here. I think Sonmez is a little bit better on offense. I think she'll just squeak by, honestly. Volinets is a wall, but, Sonmez has the pedigree and the offense to kind of earn points. Kostyuk, I saw Kostyuk walking her dog at the tournament. It's a very cute dog. Security was with her. I don't think they needed it, but nice to see. Nice to see the players out enjoying the grounds. Bolter's playing well again, so this is a tough draw. Kostyuk can kind of lose the plot and spray errors. She's had, patches of losses this year. I think she's sort of playing tennis again recently. Withdrew from her last match, though. Not really the best. Withdrew against Rybakina. She looked healthy walking the dog. But I guess, Bolter could pull the upset, there, if she's not healthy. Might be getting sleepy. Might start rushing. Maybe I was already rushing, but Noskova had a good week in Monterrey. Lost to Alexandrova, which is not bad. It's just good to see her winning matches on hard court again. She, had a bit of a slump there. Lost to Jovic, lost to Jacqueline Christian. It's not bad to lose. Anybody on tour can beat anybody on tour, but I think, you expect a bit more out of Noskova. And on a fast hard court, she can really get rushed since she hits kind of flat. Clay is probably her better surface at this point. And the other problem here, so this is a problem. It's on grass, so can discount that. But I watched Galfi play in qualifying, and she was really solid. Panna Udvardi, Fiona Crawley are not really the players you're going to recognize as big threats, but they make you play a lot of tennis. Crawley, I thought, put a ton of balls back in play, and it's the situation where Galfi would usually make some errors, and Galfi just kept driving the ball with really good depth. She looks locked in, and I think she can win this match. Just of a hitter as Noskova, so I think, when two big hitters play and they're both playing decent, tends to wind up in a deciding set, and I just think Galfi's a little bit more reliable at this point, which is, a big improvement for her. She tends to be very hit or miss on tour. Francesca Jones playing Ava Lise. It's an exciting match. Hard to really point to a clear winner there. Jones was very impressive in qualifying. She won a challenger leading up to that, so you're seeing a lot of green W's. Those are good. And Felice just had a walkover in the last event. She said that she didn't want to be injured for the U.S. Open, which is fair. Beating Maya Joint makes me think she can beat Jones, but that's probably going to be very close. If Felice is not 100%, Jones can win. Kirstea is playing really well. I don't really want to be wrong here. I think Kirstea is playing really well, and that makes it just about a situation that she should win. I think Solana Sierra is a player who's going to continue to improve on hard court and fast surfaces. Kirstea is in a final, so... Oh, sorry. Well, she won the title, which is even better. And Sierra lost to Giacomo, so I guess, Sierra should lose. She's just very solid. I think there'll be a lot of great rallies there. Kirstea hits the ball huge. Sierra's good at reflecting power. Sierra's serving decent, too, for a clay quarter. It's an unfortunate draw, I guess. I shouldn't complain about it. I should just say that Kirstea is going to win. Venus Williams gets a wild card. I'm sure there'll be some posts about that, trying to figure out if it's good or bad. I think it's good. It's good to see her play. She played well in her last outing. Moved, decent. She's not fast anymore, but, she played well. It's fun to see her play. It sells tickets. The younger players could use those wild cards, but, you kind of want to play when you're at the end of your career. You want to take a few more shots, and you'll have a bad day, but I think everyone on tour, even players in their 20s go out and have a bad day where, if you look at any player in this draw, I can circle a match they played this year where if they had a wild card, I would have said it was wasted. So, playing Makova, she doesn't have a huge chance there. But, she's super nice, pretty much. Plays well, interacts with the crowd. Nice to see her on her way out. Kasatkina should get past Ruse. Gabriela hasn't really been thriving on hard court. Hasn't been as active as Kasatkina. Kasatkina is not really at her best this year as far as winning matches, but still grinding, still training, still a tough out. Rakimova Garcia is interesting. I think Rakimova should win, given how active she's been and how many matches she's been able to win lately. But Garcia is better overall if she can get back to her top level. Leads the head-to-head also. So I think here's the issue with this. I think that Garcia is rusty. I think that Rakimova would be able to take advantage of that. But where I see it being an issue is that Rakimova doesn't really serve well, and Garcia is a really aggressive returner. So it's the kind of match where Garcia might be able to get on the front foot and just overwhelm her. So kind of expecting a closer one there than, the rust might predict. Baptiste is playing really well. Siniakova struggling to win. I do think Baptiste wins that. The best Siniakova takes the ball down the line really well, which can expose, Baptiste's movement. But Baptiste has done a lot of work on her physicality. She's in much better shape than she was previously. So I think she can grind that out. And, she has a much better serve. Siniakova kind of struggles with her delivery a little bit. Greet Miniman is playing Osaka. Should be a good match between two servers. Obviously, Osaka is the pick there. Minin plays really well, but not the best backhand. Tends to slice it a lot. Not the best mover. Osaka is a bit divisive sometimes on social media, but she's playing well, and her playing well is really good for tennis. She's very entertaining to watch. And if you like stories, there's always going to be some stories. It's a young professional living a very strange life. I can't say what I would be doing right or wrong if I were living Osaka's life. I can't say how I would be handling it. And I can't say that the environment would have equipped me to handle it perfectly. A lot of these players are somewhat sheltered. You don't know who they're around. You don't know what influences they have, good or bad. And it's easy to judge them against a balanced standard of how you expect people to be and what perspectives you expect them to have. But it's difficult to be sure that you wouldn't be in the same situation as them if you had the same life as them. We all get where we're at in completely unique and wildly different ways. So I don't know. It's a nice way of me copping out and saying I don't really have an opinion. I don't really care too much either. Good for Osaka if she wins. I'll see her next week if she doesn't. I think Gibson has a good chance to pull the upset there against Frick. She played well last week. Very locked in, powerful player. Frick is a tough out, but never unbeatable. She doesn't serve big enough to just completely eclipse, the field. So, Gibson's winning at a lower level. But that one could be close. Honestly, I thought I liked the upset there, but now that I'm looking at it and Freck had 3 with Kirstea, it's not a bad result. So maybe Freck wins a close one in the end. But Gibson I expect to win a set there at least. Semenistaha. Sorry. Send me a letter about that one. I should probably look it up before I speak. Playing Peyton Stearns, decent chance that she wins that. It's a spot where, I don't know if Stearns is going to slump forever, but I know that Klimovakova was playing really well. Her match with Korneeva in qualifying was one of the highest level matches in qualifying that I saw, period. They were hitting the ball really hard. I actually thought Korneeva would win, the way she was dominating rallies with her pace and aggression. But Klimovakova is very good and, lost in straights to Semenistaha. Jesus. She lost to Daria in the. I would delete that honestly, but I'm already 40 minutes in, so just gonna keep yapping. She's playing really well lately. Just winning a bunch of matches. She's been grinding for a while. Just off tour, and these are good wins. Winning against Poisson, winning against Shimanovic. McDonald is a good player. These are Tara Worth is a good player. Niemeyer, has been on tour before. And Stearns is not really, it's not that she's very vulnerable in general. I just think this past couple months she's been very willing to just go for shots and miss and, turn to her box and get upset. It's not, crash out level. It's not raging out or, but it's a very, I don't know what's going on kind of situation. And I think while she's working that out, she's donated some wins, the loss to Venus Williams was a bit of a donation. The loss to Siegemann, the loss to Rakhimova, these weren't great performances. She had one in particular a while back that I watched that I really hated watching, but I'm not going to find it here. It might have actually been the Siegemann loss, but yeah, overall I just think she's there to be beaten, and I think Semenistaha is playing really well right now. So I like her in that match. Vekic and Buzis Monero, I have a hard time picking against Buzis Monero because she plays so consistent, and she defends so well. When I see her against a bigger hitter, I do see the issue with her game. She really does just go cross court off both wings, and it makes it hard for her to score when the other player is hitting the ball bigger. Vekic lost to Mertens, beat Zachary. These are decent wins. A win and a loss here and there is kind of how her season has gone. She's been sort of right near finding her best form. Her best form obviously is, a top 30 player, but, not there all the time. Buzis losing to Rakhimova, not too great. Vekic winning their previous matchup doesn't mean a lot to me because in 2021, Buzis Monero was just barely getting to tour level. So, I think I like the Spaniard there. Very tricky, could be close. I wouldn't be surprised either way. I think that's important. It's one question to ask if you're betting on something is, would any result, any player winning in 2 or 3 or in any scoreline, would any result really surprise you? And if the answer is no, then you really shouldn't be wagering at all because it hasn't happened yet. The books are going to give you prices. I'm going to tell you, data points that you want to know about, going in and what the ifs are and what the minor equations are. But at the end of the day, the players have to get on the court and play. And, a lot can go, different there. The wind, Sina was playing Gomez in qualifying and, had a big chance, threw the ball up to serve, and the wind kicked up and the ball wound up behind his head and he, ended up getting broken that game. So, can you see that coming, the day before? You can Google the weather, but I'm just saying there's a lot that happens on the court that can shift things. The umpire can mess up, a ruling. A fan can be annoying. There's just a lot of, momentum shifts that can happen. The players can crack under the pressure too. They can also get upset and lose their head. I guess it's just a long way of saying that it would be a bit silly to bet on this match. And a bit silly to predict it also. But since I'm very silly, I just don't like Vekic there. I don't think that the ceiling makes me believe. I think Buzis Monero is a tough out and will grind her down. I think she moves well also, and Vekic does play a lot of drop shots. So we'll see. But I think Monero is having a better season. Goff should beat Tomljanovic. It'll be a close one. Isla plays really well, hits the ball hard. Everybody on tour should be hitting the ball to Goff's forehand 100% of the time at this point. It really can break down. It tends to break down even if you don't hit the ball there, but I wouldn't want to deal with her backhand at all. It doesn't make sense. Her backhand is, might be the best on tour. I I can't think of a candidate for it to be, too much worse than, maybe Swiatek has has more variation, more topspin, but Goff crushes the ball on her backhand. Towson is in this list. She has a really solid backhand, but not as good as Goff's. Even while having struggles on serve, Goff is still winning tournaments. She won a major this year, so hard to write her off of anything. I think she wins there. I just think, it's not automatic anymore for her, especially in the early rounds. Anisimova should beat Burrell. Burrell seems consistent to me when I watch her play, but just a lot of matches where she's up 5-2 and winds up at 5-all. A lot of overtime sets, so just not really finding a clear way to get herself through. She does hit the ball huge. She can play consistent, but if you're hitting the ball huge and playing consistent and having close sets, it means, you're kind of just showing the other players where you're hitting the ball. You're like letting them hang in rallies and letting them play and do less and stay in there. I think Kachanov has that problem too on the men's side. He does a lot well, but doesn't seem to get a big effect out of all the things that he's doing well. He'll play against a guy like Mochizuki who's shorter, hits the ball not as hard, doesn't serve as big, and all of a sudden it's in a tiebreaker. It's maybe it's a coaching thing, maybe it's just altering shot selection, being a bit more aggressive, or working in other shots. You watch guys like Rublev and Shapo and Kachanov and let's say Burrell too, and you watch them hit the ball solid and hard on every shot, and the other player, gets played sort of into form against the same pace all the time. And, not to criticize these players, but they're pros, and I don't ever see the drop shot get played. You're not going to score with it all the time, but, if you keep the player closer to the baseline, suddenly the weight of your shot is more effective, So you really need to have, I think, all those tools if you want to win more often. Your game has to be complete, and your game shouldn't look the same every day, and your game shouldn't look the same against every player. We talk a lot in press about, the players are told to say, I just played my tennis. I focused on my tennis. And they tell them on the court to focus on playing your tennis, which is good advice. You want to apply your craft. You want to play, the way that you feel comfortable. You want to go first. You don't want to wait and find out, what shot the other opponent is going to go for, because you can't really outrun the ball, in professional racket sports. But at the same time, you can't just do the same thing over and over again and pretend the player on the other side doesn't have some weaknesses. So be interesting to see, her change her game a bit. Anisimova has a decent draw here. She could go pretty far. So be good to start there with a straight set win. Joint and Kasanseva have an interesting spot. Kasanseva pulled a big, I guess not a huge upset, but beating Emerson Jones in the finals of qualifying was really good. I think Kasanseva had a lot of hype surrounding her for a while when she first got around the tour. I don't think she necessarily backed it up, lost a lot of close matches, kind of got frustrated in a lot of situations. It seemed like she's calmer now, more willing to grind. Emerson Jones really good. I like the way she, goes after her shots. I like the way she creates down the line with her backhand. Everything is good about her game, and she's probably going to wind up on tour. So stopping that run there was really good. Maya Joint is very solid. I think this will be, a match where I think Kasanseva might get outlasted from the baseline. Jones had a lot of errors in their match, so I do think it could be close, though. Kasanseva had that hype. Now that she's playing well, the ceiling is once again a bit undefined. She's lefty, which is always useful on tour. Big forehand. Just a traditional kind of clay court game. So I like Joint, but, it's worth watching that one. Danielle Collins, not really at her best, not really challenging for titles these days, but should be Jacqueline Christian. Kruger is playing decent. I think, maybe too many errors to beat Kennan. Kennan's not really automatic these days, but yeah. It's these like Pavlyuchenkova, Buzis Monero, Paolini losses that are not really bad, but it's matches she's going to lose, kind of. The errors are still there for Kruger. It's a player. If you watch Samsonova, Rybakina, or Sabalenka early in their career, these are basically the years for them too, where they were losing most of these matches against players who were very solid, and they would occasionally outduel a top player or win a match against another, offense. So Kenin kind of merges those things. She's not really winning a ton of matches lately, but she moves the ball well. I think she can maybe expose Kruger's movement. Just beat her in Doha in a close match. So, I guess here we expect kind of a similar thing. Kenin probably in 2 or 3. Haddad Maya is, still struggling. Cartel should probably beat her there. I'd say Bella has gotten a little bit better every month this year, but just when she started winning matches, she started kind of losing them again also. So not a ton to go off there. I think Cartel is a little bit more confident, in a little bit better form. Not really dominant there, though. I think that one really is an arm wrestling match. Louise Boisson is not really playing great on hard court yet, and Golubic just played really well last week. It's kind of out of nowhere for me, but when she's playing well, she does well. She also served something like 80% first serves in a couple matches, which is genius, honestly. She does not have a big serve, so if she's putting the ball in play and just getting to the tennis, it's a good route. I think you used to see Paolo Lorenzi, if you've been watching tennis for a while. Paolo Lorenzi used to and Stéphane Robert would just put the ball in play, and getting a high first serve percentage in meant that even though your first serve's not that good, your opponent's a bit on the defensive. Same thing I talked about with Ayala. It's just smart tennis. So Golubic should win that. Sakkari just beat Tatiana Maria, I think, somewhere. So probably backs up that result again. Sakkari's still losing troubling matches, but sort of showing signs of life this year. So should win that. Svitolina should outlast Bondar. Bondar is a good player, much better on clay though. Svitolina, again, one of the best players of this era to not have a major. So interesting to see how she does in this draw. Alexandrova should beat Sevastova. A lot of variety and slices and drop shots. I think Sevastova's been snagging players who, might not be totally familiar with her game. But Alexandrova, I think, leads the head-to-head. Oh, no, they haven't played. And I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, Alexandrova was pretty solid last week, though, and, tends to play well for a week or two in a row. So her being in Swiatek's draw is actually pretty interesting for me because she's given her a pretty good beating before on a fast hard court. Dolehide against Wang, 2 huge offenses. Not really sure who's going to thrive. I think Wang, a little bit more consistent. Dolehide, slightly better serving. I don't think either player is going to defend too well when the other player is getting inside the baseline. I just think Wang is a slightly better athlete. Zakharova with a good draw. She's been grinding. She's lost some close matches and big moments. Avanesian has not really been active this season. Been just kind of losing constantly. Not really sure what the issue is, but Zakharova should win. Siegemund Schneider, 2 weeks ago would have been a match I thought Siegemund would win. But Schneider just turned in a really good week in Monterey. She's in the finals, or did she win? No, she won the title. Excellent. It's another title for Schneider. I think she has, 3 or 4 at this point. Or maybe 2 or 3 might be more accurate. But really good player. Seeing that Siegemund won both previous meetings is a bit scary. Schneider can get outdueled. So maybe that one's a bit closer than I think. Recency bias is huge. I think, Schneider's been playing much better because of last week's result. But prior to that, she'd been slumping, and she can kind of lose the plot and miss a bit. She's always going for offense on the court, so that one, I think she'll just get by. Kalinskaya against Clervy Ngune is Hope I'm not pronouncing that wrong, but I probably am. Is a tough one. Clary is another player who just really can extend rallies, plays really well, and has proven she could win. She beat Baptiste, beat Yue Yuan. Gadeki's kind of donating wins, but that's a tour level win. And I think Nguyen is on her way to the tour. She's powerful. She has a good serve. I mean, you're seeing a ton of wins. Yeah, they're lower level wins, but the players that tend to win a lot at the lower level do make their way on tour. I'm a bit surprised she's down at 179, but probably not for long. Kalinskaya is playing really well right now, so it's a rough draw for her getting a wild card and playing a player who, again, it depends when you play people. If you played Kalinskaya 2 months ago, you'd expect her to withdraw or just lose, but now she probably wins that in 2 or 3. It honestly could go 3. Clary's a really competent player, very solid from the baseline, and again, good power. So I'll just keep repeating myself, but not change my prediction. Elisabetta Cocciaretto is playing well. Putintseva is having a dismal season, so I think the Italian can win that there. She's serving well, did pretty decent last week. Lamens against Glozman. I'm not too familiar with Glozman, but I don't think she's really playing tour level. Yeah, a lot of lower level stuff. Not really there yet. But good to get that experience. And Lamens doesn't really ace you. She's a baseliner, so Glozman will get to play a lot of tennis there on a big stage. Great moment for her. And Swiatek, should cook Arango. I don't see Arango having much that'll hurt Iga. Iga's playing really well. She's might be the second favorite in the odds right now for the tournament, and it's well deserved. It seems like she's figured out how to play on hard court, and I don't see that going away. Honestly, she struggled on fast surfaces for so very long that I think that now that she's kind of gotten these consistent results on them for a period, I don't think she'll lose the plot again. I think she'll start to believe in herself, and a lot of it is belief for her. If you watch her lose, and then the time I mentioned the Alexandra Androva match, some of the other matches she's lost on hard court, I think if you watch those matches, her reaction to how things are going and her tendency to try to fight the ball off and force things and just try to impose herself kind of made her crash out of matches. And I think, now she doesn't do that anymore. She's more comfortable. She knows she has the legs to run. She knows she can create. She knows she's going to serve decent. Ironing out the serving issues is big too. I think you'll see, as Goff does that also, she'll become, a bit more consistent also on the faster courts. So pretty good draw. It's 1 a.m. now. Sorry for posting this so late, but schedule's a little weird. I'm actually in New York for this tournament, so it's a little weird for me since mostly I'm going to be doing these at nighttime. I think going forward, I'll probably try to split it up by day so that I can get them up. During the day, while the other matches are going on. But anyway, if you listened, thanks. Sorry if you're listening and I mispronounced your name. I'm going to check out some pronunciations before the next round, I promise.